Alright, so I mentioned recently that I was gonna be kind of like tryharding this next month a lot more than usual. Less experimentation and less like full-on just kind of like concept building, and more deck refinement in terms of like top decks, best decks in the game, that kind of thing. And in the spirit of that, we have recently proclaimed that my new Kinko deck is the best deck in the game. At the time of recording, I am currently ranked number 1 NA with this deck. The 255 is LP, it's not ranking now. So yeah, right now we just hit rank number 1 on NA ladder with this deck. Actually, we hit it about a day ago, and we've maintained it with this deck since then. It took about 2 days to climb with this deck from Platinum to Masters rank 1. And yeah, like I mentioned, I do think it is one of the 2 best decks in the game, the other one being Heimer Vi. And this is going to be my guide for this deck. Let's go ahead and break this deck down. I'm going to talk about the deck building. I'm going to talk about a lot of the decisions that I made in constructing, well, you might not say, you know, it's a known archetype. It is Kinko elusives. It's a pre-existing archetype. It's not a new concept, but you'll be able to tell the deck is built very differently. It's actually 8 cards off the standard Kinko elusives before I started messing around with it. And at this point, I can tell you this will become the new standard, at least, you know, a couple cards different. This is the best way to play Kinko elusives. And yeah, I think that it is both a fairly easy deck to get into. You will win a lot of games without having to be nuts at the deck while still maintaining a fairly high skill ceiling. And on top of that, it's super cheap to craft. You will have to craft the 3rd Zed in this case. This is not, definitely can't be 2 Zed in this particular version, but for the most part, this is going to be an amazing deck. It'll climb you like crazy for everyone, for new players, for, you know, if you are just looking for a deck that's like non-committal to play, if you're looking to like boost your rank, this deck will climb anyone. And stick around, because I promise in this guide I will be showing you a way to play this deck that you definitely didn't see before. This is a deck that, I did mention, it's not a hard deck to get into, but it's not an easy deck to master either. The way to play this deck at a high level is going to be very counterintuitive, and you will learn a lot if you stick around for the different games we're going to do today on this guide. Now, this deck guide is going to be a little bit different from mine in the past, which is we're actually going to be showing you gameplay from specific games during my climb to Masters over the last several days, and I've been able to pick games that have been able to kind of like showcase a lot of different qualities, so it should be a much better process. Now, let's go ahead and take a little bit to talk about the deck build and the properties of the deck build before we get into the actual deck guide itself. I highly recommend you don't skip the gameplay, but if you want to, at this point in time, you can skip to the actual games if you want to see the footage now. You're not going to miss out on an incredible amount. So if you haven't seen a Kinko elusives concept before, which, you know, I mean, some of you guys haven't, basically what this deck is doing is it's running all Ionia cards mostly so that we can get odds on Kinko Wayfinder, and mostly we are playing a somewhat aggressive game plan. We're going to be playing elusives early and often. We're going to play, usually playing Zed on turn 3, Kinko Wayfinder on turn 4. This Wayfinder is going to be pulling out Omen Hawks and Navori Blade Scouts, and we are going to be playing a lot of elusives and winning the game with the opponent's inability to block. For example, a turn could easily be on turn 4, we play a Green Glade duo, the first of which on our board. On turn 5, we play a second Green Glade duo, which represents a total of 5 elusive damage, because the first one is now at 3 attack. Then, after that, we play a Navori Blade Scout, which represents, at this point, a total of 9 elusive damage, because it's 2 and it will buff both the duos by 1. And then maybe we play a Keeper of Masks, representing a grand total of 14 elusive damage. And this is a very common play that you can make on literally turn 5, right? Like this, that would be 14 elusive damage that you can just swing into your opponent on turn 5, and they can't block it, right? That's a fairly common thing that this deck can do. Basically, just kind of like stuff like that, and you are usually going to be winning off the back of your elusive keyword, and your Zed and your concussive palm are going to be kind of like your counters to aggro. That's the concept in a nutshell. So we're going to go ahead and explain this deck build and why this is better than other Kinko versions. So the first thing you'll notice is this deck has 4 one-ofs. Now, one-ofs in deck building I think are actually something that is very underrated, and even I in the past have underrated them. But I do want to say 4 one-ofs is still pretty irregular, and almost every optimized deck doesn't want to be at nearly that many one-ofs. Like, as a rule of thumb, if it has more than 2 one-ofs, the deck is usually unoptimized. Now, in this case, all of our one-ofs are representing specific value, as well as on top of that, we are pigeonholed into a very weird selection of cards because of our Kinko Wayfinder forcing our Allegiance hand, which does mean that we are going to have to use some kind of unusual deck building choices. The idea of a one-of is typically in deck building known as a card that you really don't want to draw 2 of them, and you don't even want to draw 1 of them enough that it's okay to sometimes draw 2 of them, right? That is, in this case, Solitary Monk, Deny, Elixir of Iron, and Highwayman. Elixir is good, but the Allegiance odds do make it just not quite worth it. So let me explain this a little bit further and talk about the identity of certain cards representing like additional value if you are only able to draw it without its parity card. So another way of putting it, well, why run a one-of? A lot of one-ofs in the game are actually sort of a 4th copy of a different card in disguise, if that makes sense. So for example, if you really want a 4th 1-drop, but you already have your 3 1-drops, you can run a one-of there, right? If that's just the number of the specific category that you want. So to give an example, Navori Highwayman almost functions as, in the form of competing resources, a 4th Kinko Wayfinder. Now that might seem surprising because Highwayman and Kinko Wayfinder actually do very different things. But basically the idea is Highwayman is good when I haven't drawn Wayfinder, and in that capacity the one-of logic makes sense, right? I want to draw 1 of this 4 of, which are the 3 Wayfinders of Highwayman. Highwayman is a card that loses value if it's unable to kind of like flood the board. But if my board is lacking on space and I need to go a little bit wider, stabilize a little bit earlier in the events that I haven't drawn a Wayfinder, then Highwayman hits big value. Monk, in the same way, is a 4th Green Glade Duo. Now again, these aren't really similar cards, but in the hands where I haven't drawn Duo, or maybe my Duo dies right away, being able to Monk on turn 3 as kind of like my opener elusive is actually pretty valuable. When you play this deck, you will draw a Monk that very often you won't be able to play, and that's usually fine. I know that seems weird, but most of the situations where you draw Monk late and it's useless are situations where you've already won the game, because of course you own the board at that point. Okay. So, for the most part, that's how this deck is constructed. That's a lot of the logic behind it. Now, let's compare this to the normal, or let's say the standard version of Kinko Elusives. To be honest, like I said, this will become the new standard, but what I will say is like the past version of Kinko Elusives, which has run 3 Jewel's Protector. This has been kind of like the flavor for a long time, as well as 3 Kinko Lifeblade. This version is running 0 of both of them, and therein kind of lies the obvious biggest difference between this and any normal Kinko deck. So, the sole reason is the meta is too fast for those cards, period. The meta is the fastest it has ever been in the game right now. We are in a blazing fast meta. If you are against an aggro deck, you're racing them down. If you're against Heimer Vi, you have to kill it before the Heimer sticks. Anything that's slower than that is just getting completely BTFO'd in this metagame, right? So that's principle number 1, and from that principle, we go to 3 Keepers. Keeper is an absolutely insane card right now. I think this card was probably correct in this deck even before this meta got accelerated so much, but I will say Keeper as a 3 of is absolutely carrying the deck in a lot of ways. This card wins you a lot of games. Now, of course, both Lifeblade and Protector have to end up being cut. They kind of are only good with each other. ultimately, and they're too slow for the metagame. And likewise there, we're going to be cutting one hatchling. Perfectly fine. Hatchling is still a good card. It's not as if, you know, the 7 mana... The game's not over on 7, but you do need to be ending it on these turns. So hatchling is still fine, but it's less necessary to have a third hatchling because, you know, we have Keeper being kind of a bit of an alt finisher. You definitely can win a lot of games without hatchling these days. And, of course, you don't want to be double drawing it so consistently here. Then, on top of that, we have kind of our swaps. Now, the biggest ones are basically for the face of the aggro sort of matchups, and these we have like, you know, 1 Highwayman and 2 Concussive Palm. Concussive Palm is really good against like the current versions of aggro here. It's a decent value card in general, like it's just like a nice flexible card, but especially against a lot of Basilisk Rider decks that you're going to be seeing, especially when so tomorrow I'm going to be playing my EU account and I'm going to be optimizing a Basilisk Rider deck. I'm pretty sure I can build a better Basilisk Rider deck than any of the ones we've been seeing on ladder yet. And yeah, Concussive Palm is going to be really, really necessary against all of that. So what that is going to mean is, yes, we're going to want to be on 2 Concussive Palm here, okay? So this is basically the breakdown in a nutshell. Elixir of Iron isn't great right now. It's just like a little too slow. It's nice having as a 1-of, but it's just not quite worth double drawing. Fury of the North is amazing as a 2-of. I almost want to push this to 3-of. It is a really, really good card, but it's just not quite worth it, especially with the Allegiance odds that you really, really need to be preserving off of Kinko Wayfinder, and you'll definitely see why if you watch me play this deck a lot. Anyway, that's kind of the basics of the deck build. Now, let me actually take a step back and we'll talk about like how we want to operate this in game. Okay, so now that we know all that, well, how do we play the deck? Well, we're going to get into the gameplay soon, and I'll be able to talk about a lot in the gameplay. But let's first just talk rule number 1, mulligans. Okay, so in the mulligans, we're always keeping Omen Hawk. We're probably always keeping Duo. I'm actually experimenting with kicking Duo in some matchups, but for the sake here, always keep Omen Hawk, always keep Duo. You should mostly be keeping Zed. We might talk about a little bit of situations where you will be mulliganing away Zed, but especially if you're attacking at odds, you always want to keep Zed. Don't keep a second copy of Zed almost ever. So just keep 1 Zed, and you're going to want to keep Kinko Wayfinder. Usually you'll keep a double Wayfinder hand, although some matchups might necessitate a kick there. Lastly, of course, you are keeping Elixir of Iron. It is, you know, a non-allegiance card, but it takes a control matchup for me to keep Fury of the North. I'll pretty much only keep Fury of the North if I'm against PNZ or a Mirror or Shadow Isles matchup, because Fury of the North is your anti-control card. When they use removal on your unit, you basically do a big burst down, similar to old Mark of the Islands if you have played back then. Okay. So that is kind of like the general, you know, pattern to the early game for this deck. You should basically always be mulliganing Shadow Assassin. I will never keep this except maybe the Shadow Isles matchup. You should basically always be kicking Solitary Monk. But Navori Conspirator, I would keep if I have Omen Hawk, and in no other circumstances, actually. I always kick Conspirator if I don't have Omen Hawk. Especially, I don't like keeping Conspirator Blade Scout. Then we've got Keeper of the Masks and Highwayman. I would only keep these against an aggro matchup. You do want to be drawing these a bit later if you are playing a sort of like slower deck, right? If you're playing against aggro, though, they're great to keep. And then finally, we've got Blade Scout, which is, by the way, not often a keep. Well, okay, I should clarify. It is often a keep, but it's not a keep in a lot of situations that I think a lot of people would keep it in. Ultimately, you're going to want to keep it against aggro, and you're going to want to keep it in situations like, for example, where the opponent is going to have like an empty board on the first several turns. But I will be kicking this out of a decent amount of hands. The reason being is you do want to draw into it later because it is basically a 1-mana 2/1 without a keyword, right? The elusive keyword doesn't really do anything early. Basically, if you play it for turn 1 and it gives the elusive keyword, that's only relevant if the opponent has something like an Omen Hawk or a hapless aristocrat on their board. And the problem with that is if they have one of those cards on their board, then a Void Blade Scout will get to attack on turn 1 and then not for another, no, I mean, not really again, because it loses the elusive and the opponent has a really powerful blocker against Blade Scout on their side of the board. So you really should think of Blade Scout as, if you play it early, it is a 1 mana 2/1 without an effect, basically. And that is how you should think about it in the mulligan. Do I want to keep a 1 mana 2/1 without an effect? And often right now in the meta, the answer to that is actually yes, just because there's a lot of aggro and a lot of like Heimer Vi beatdown stuff like that. And, you know, a 1 mana 2/1 without an effect is actually fine against those. But if you don't want that, don't keep Blade Scout. Okay, so we're going to get into our first game here. Like I said, this is going to be a recording from the climb I did to Rank 1 Masters. And what that means is, I might be stopping and starting to talk about exactly, trying to be thorough about like the decision-making process, because there's a lot that's really important to understand. So right away, we're against a Control Shadow Isles deck. It's Karina Vi, but Control Shadow Isles kind of mostly plays the same, so it's going to be a very similar protocol to like Brown Manivia, or even stuff like Deep. So in this case, what we're going to do is look at the mulligan. Now, I will sometimes keep Blade Scout in the opening hand here, but I'm actually very reluctant against decks that have Hapless Aristocrat, and Blade Scout isn't really going to be blocking a whole lot. I actually will pretty much be looking to kick Blade Scout in matchups like this. Keeper is something you can keep in your opening hand as an anti-aggro card, but you want to be drawing it later against control. Now, Shadow Assassin, like I said, you usually don't keep, but I'm making a bit of an exception here just because this is going to be a really slow matchup. We're not going to be able to rush them down, so we do kind of need to outlast them. And then on top of that, Elixir of Iron is, of course, going to be great here. We will be able to save something from dying, which is super impactful, but it also sort of messes up with the curve of the hand. Shadow Assassin might allow us to sort of like replenish, the extra card loss because Elixir is a very cheap card in an otherwise long matchup. So this is a bit of an interesting spot. We're attacking on odds here, and a really big thing is, of course, we have Zed. In fact, we have 2 Zeds. Okay, so I'm going to stop for a minute and talk about Zed as a champion, Zed as a card, and how we should be playing him. Zed is actually one of the hardest things in the entire deck to be playing. There's a ton you have to think about when it goes into this card. So rule number 1, you really have to know when you should avoid playing Zed entirely. Usually these are in like mid-game spots where you have the ability, your opponent might be a little lower on health, or maybe they have a bigger board. And so you're thinking, okay, I'm probably going to end this in like 2 elusive attacks. Zed's not going to do anything because we're going to bypass the board instead of trying to go through it, right? In this case, it is true that Zed on the current board is kind of weak. They have a Hapless Aristocrat, right? So if you're just thinking about the current board, you could think, well, maybe I should Shadow Assassin here and just bypass. Because Hapless Aristocrat, this card does counter Zed. It's a bit of a wall. But it's not really about this turn or this particular board state. It's about how the next like 5, 6, 7 turns are going to play out. And ultimately, his health is really high. This is going to be a long game. We will have spots where like his board is clear, and therefore we should play for Zed. And that's going to be pretty easy here. So it's an easy decision to play Zed here, but you really need to be making sure that you're thinking about it the right way. So he's going to threaten the Mystic Shot. And for some reason, I end up thinking about this for 10 seconds before I make this super, super, super obvious decision. This should be like a snap decision. This shouldn't even have any thought in your mind. And the decision is we're going to let the Zed die. Not even close. Elixir of Iron would be a terrible, terrible play here. Now, the biggest reason is because we have a second Zed in our hand, we need to be able to free it up. Whereas if it stays alive on the board, then our second Zed is a Shadow Shift. Basically, by letting the Zed die there and keeping the Elixir of Iron for later, what we're accomplishing is we are basically having an Elixir of Iron in our hand instead of a Shadow Shift. And that's a really big deal because Shadow Shift is completely useless. So when you have double Zed like that, don't go out of your way to save the first Zed, right? Especially when the opponent might have a re-response. Elixir of Iron wants to be used when you are saving something that, you know, is threatening damage right then and there, and hopefully the opponent just doesn't have the ability to re-respond, right? You want to have kind of like last say when it comes to this kind of thing. Okay, so they're going to take a Vile Feast. This is a pretty weird Vile Feast, honestly. It looks super weak. It's a power card. It definitely can be used to threaten some other things. And because they took a super loose Vile Feast like that, we're thinking to ourselves, there's a decent chance they have a second Vile Feast. So a bit of a tip, when the opponent uses a card in a loose way, loose basically meaning low value, you want to be thinking, okay, there's a decent chance they have a second one and they just used it because they have a backup. So here we have a total of 8 mana. It's turn 5. We're kind of like nearing like the Ruination turns, and we're going to talk a lot about how to play around that. And so we have the big decision here about what exactly we want to do on this board. Now, this is going to be a long game, and I mean, you look at this game, opponent's at 20 health, they're playing a really slow deck. We're setting up here, right? And so because of that, we do want to make sure we're returning the Kinko to our hand to potentially get an additional one. We'll play the Shadow Assassin here and bypass his defenders, trying to see if we can like set up some damage. So now we can see like Zed in this particular board wasn't doing as much. A big reason for that was just because the Shadow Assassin did get basically double buffed, so it's just a little too juicy to not play here. And also he had the other vanilla spider here, so the Zed definitely feels less than it did 2 turns ago. Now you look at this board state and suddenly, you know, we're threatening 6 damage. He's going to go down to 14, and these are the kind of games where it's very possible we may never play this Zed. We might just kill with elusives and elusives alone. We'll see. It depends how it goes. Now, a really big deal is we didn't play the duo here, the Green Glade duo. And it probably, especially if I back up, it looks sort of like it should be an obvious play to play the Green Glade duo instead of the Navori Conspirator. I think that's what most people would have done in these kinds of positions, because you're threatening more damage, right? It's like you get the duo out early and it starts growing and it starts threatening. I don't want to be doing that. I'm playing into a lot of ranges by doing that. The first big range is, you know, especially since it's first action, it's not even impossible he could be on like Withering Wail at this point. But also like second Vile Feast, I don't want to be enabling for no reason. Now, it's really big. A lot of people would look at that duo and be like, well, if he has a Vile Feast, then I've got Elixir of Iron anyway, right? So it's no big deal. That is definitely not the way you want to think about it. Elixir of Iron will always be a value card. Vile Feast doesn't necessarily have to be, depending on how the game goes out, right? So here we get a great Elixir of Iron. This is the Elixir of Iron we want. It is in a situation where the opponent can't respond. It is in a situation where it's guaranteed to do damage because it's mid-combat swing, and it's saving a unit that will remain a threat later. This is a 2 health unit, so he will have to deal with this specifically. It won't just die to like a random Withering Wail. Okay, so he's going to threaten the Shadow Assassin with Vi. This is actually a little bit awkward. It's just kind of unfortunate how the stats line up. I mean, he gets the free 4/4. There's not too much we can really be doing about that, but it's not like we're running out of steam in our hand, especially off of bouncing the Kinko. So in a lot of games, even against slow decks, you do want to be able to rush them down, but just because we didn't really have a good early start, we knew, and on top of that, because his deck is really slow and doesn't output much pressure, we knew we had to set up for the late game. And that's why we bounced the Kinko, because there's a good chance we're going to want to double Kinko here. Right. Now, it's going to be our attack on 7, and I think the biggest thing there is, like, we'll talk about how potentially, you know, the Ruination might go down, because there's going to be a lot, I think, a lot of misconceptions about how to play around Ruination. I need to make a standalone video about that, because I think people, a surprising amount of people are playing around Ruination completely backwards, and they will open attack to beat a Ruination, which is exactly the opposite of what you want to be doing. So anyway, I'll play a Kinko, pretty basic. The opponent will Static Shock, not too high value, totally fine. You'll note I'm actually, as a player, I fairly often end up playing Kinko on defense. A lot of people, when they play this deck, I've heard a couple of times people say that you're supposed to play Kinko on offense for like Blade Scout stuff. And I mean, first of all, I think it shouldn't really matter whether it's defense or offense. You shouldn't really be thinking about that too much. But also, I think it's probably better on average on defense because you want to be kind of like doing it before your big setup attack things, right? And trying to greet a big green glade duo never really works out. Okay, so basically, this is kind of the range of turns where we have to start thinking about Ruination, because the Corona decks are going to run 1 or 2 Ruinations, and it's something that you do want to play around in a specific way. So here's how you play around Ruination. You develop something fairly non-committal, something not necessarily small, but nothing too big, and then if they pass back to you, then maybe you can take the attack there. You'll see. Of course, then, you know, if they play some mana, then you can keep developing because Ruination isn't a threat. The biggest thing you have to understand about Ruination, and this is like the most important thing, is that the way Ruination gets value is by baiting you into open attacking, and that's how fast speed spells get value, is by open attacking. Shadow Isles has 1 slow speed threat, and literally like all of the rest of their cards will punish open attacking, because cards like Whale, cards like Grasp, cards like Vile Feast, these cards basically gain value from you open attacking. To beat fast speed cards, you need to develop into them so that you can at least spend mana on the same turn your opponent's spending the mana. Now, how we need to think about Ruination is basically just think about all of our plays and ask ourselves, okay, if the opponent Ruinates here, would we be good? So I'm thinking, okay, if I Wayfinder, yeah, I'll get, you know, maybe an Omen Hawk. I'll maybe buff a couple things. If I force out a big Ruination, well, then after my Wayfinder, I'll still have my other Zed, and it'll be an empty board, so that'll deal a good amount of damage. Totally fine. Then I realize, and you'll see, you might have seen my mouse hover there, I realized that the Hapless Aristocrat would actually be, it summons the Spider off of Ruination, so it's a really good Zed blocker, which means that suddenly Kinko Wayfinder isn't as good into Ruination as I'm thinking. I do want to play a card. You definitely can't open attack. You should basically almost never open attack into Shadow Isles. Almost never. And by the way, it's the same against most other control decks, like P and Z Ionia decks as well are kind of the same way. So we're going to play Shadow Assassin here. Now, if he Ruinates, he gets an okay Ruination, but we have a Kinko, which is totally fine. The Kinko will be able to play after that. He instead goes for the second Static Shock here, which I'm perfectly happy with. There's no reason to save this Navori Blade Scout, because Twin Disciplines is a card that will gain value later. So now the opponent's down to 6 mana, and, you know, we have to be thinking, okay, well, it's likely he's going to be on the stuff like Withering Whale now. We're going to just try to threaten a bit more damage in a semi-non-committal way. A really big deal is we do have one of the Twin Disciplines, so he goes down to 5 mana off of Hapless. This, if anything, increases the odds that it's going to be a Withering Whale or perhaps a Grasp. And then, you know, he'll pass back to us, and we'll take the swing in here. Really, we're never going to develop Omen. We're never going to attack with our land unit. And we expect a Whale here, or at the very least, a Grasp. So the Whale is going to come down, and we have the Twin Disciplines on the Green Glade Duo. Oh, yeah, actually, sorry, this isn't a Whale. I'm misremembering this. Yeah. He gotchas instead, so it's like, oh, yeah, that's totally fine. So, I mean, I'll just save the Green Glade Duo and maintain this amount of damage to face. So this is a lot of damage. This is a total of 11, sending him to 3. And, of course, you know, we don't have a closeout yet. And now this is the kind of game where we're definitely thinking, well, Zed is probably useless. You know, you look at his board. He's got a bunch of land blockers. He's at low health, and those are 2 check marks for saying, okay, let's ignore Zed and just go for the complete elusive plan, right? So, this is going to be fairly interesting. He's going to send his Vi into the Green Glade Duo. Bit of an act of desperation here. It's not going to mean too much to me. He's going to have to probably like submit a spell or something like that, because otherwise he's, you know, I mean, killing an elusive is kind of nice, but it's not going to accomplish too much otherwise. And yeah, I mean, he actually submitted nothing on that, so we're just going to let that happen. That's totally fine. No reason to do anything weird. So at this point in time, again, we always have to play around with things you could have. We're going to go ahead and Wayfinder. We actually were counting all of our 1-mana cards in our deck, and we only had one left, the Blade Scout, because we drew the Omen Hawk, which means even though the board would have normally been too full for this, it's a perfectly fine play. And we're just kind of like maybe expecting a few different things he could do on defense. So he's going to go ahead and, threaten a Ruination here. And this one's going to be a little bit interesting. I do actually have an opportunity, if I want to deny this. And then we would go to next turn. I would have the open attack with the elusives. And between like the big open attack and with the Twin Disciplines, we should basically get it through, right? The single biggest thing is we need to be playing around Karina at this point in time. We were actually not expecting him to Ruinate on the defensive turn. A little bit weird, but because Karina is actually a bit of a threat, and because we can't really develop since our board is pretty much full at this point, it is very likely that we might take an open attack here, okay? So now we're going to think to ourselves, okay, what are we going to do, right? Because it's going to go to our turn. So we're thinking, should we open attack? Well, imagine if he plays Ruination. Imagine if he plays Karina, right? If we play Omen Hawk, and he plays Ruination, well, then we win because we play Solitary Monk and then we kill him, right? He has no answer. So if we play Omen Hawk and he plays Karina Viraza, well, then we win because we play Solitary Monk and he has no answer. And therefore, we don't open attack because there's no reason to, right? We beat both Ruination and Karina by not open attacking. And by the way, usually this will be the case. And this is your thought process. This is not just with this deck, but this should be your thought process with Shadow Isles. In this case, I'm going to go ahead and do the Solitary Monk play instead. It ends up being completely the same, which is like, it doesn't lose to anything. It's probably technically slightly better just because I get a little bit more elusive presence on the board, actually. So there's no reason to be open attacking. There's no reason to be afraid. Again, we're good against everything. If he Karinas, we win. If he Ruinates, we win. But the fast speed things are the real threat here. And that's going to be true for every control deck. The fast speed stuff is the real threat, right? So because of that, we do want to make sure we're developing nicely into an attack. We are not going to attack too early or too easily. Now that we have, Twin Disciplines mana left, now we can take our attack and we've got lethal, okay? So that's a fairly clean game, all things considered. Like somewhat not super straightforward, but I think it's going to do a decent job at kind of like explaining several of the concepts here that you have to be thinking about when you're playing this deck, but also just in general. Let's go ahead and get into the next game. So you'll notice when I'm playing this deck, I think that in these recordings, like 1 or 2 cards might be different from the version that I have on this guide. And that's just because, these recordings might be outdated by 1 or 2 cards since I was tweaking the deck as I went. Anyway, here we're going to be against Twisted Fate Jinx, which is going to be Mogwai's like casino deck, which is like a sort of like early game sort of meme kind of like high roll deck that has a lot of tools. They run Suit Up. They run, slot bot, stuff like that. So they aren't aggressive enough for me to be willing to keep Keeper of Masks. They're not like an aggro deck, so I'm not going to need it that early. But because we're attacking on turn 1 and because we do actually value the Blade Scout body, we'll keep Blade Scout here. So as I mentioned during the actual just like deck guide portion, Blade Scout, keep it whenever you would keep a vanilla, non-elusive, no effect, 1 mana 2/1. That's it. That's when you should keep Blade Scout. It's that simple because you can use it for the elusive early or late. The elusive doesn't matter. It's just 1 free point of damage. So it's just a 1 mana 2/1. This is a matchup where I look at a 1 mana 2/1 and I'm like, yeah, that's pretty good. Astute Academic, we see that dropped here. That's going to contest it pretty well. It doesn't get like, thwarted by stuff like Hapless or Omen Hawk. So it feels perfectly fine to be keeping here. In this case, they're just going to get a little bit of a hit in. Here we have Jeweled Protector, which I was running back in the day. I hate that card right now. It's terrible in this meta, and I'm very glad I cut it. But yeah, it's in the hand for this particular game. So we have the ability to output a little bit of pressure here. Now, this is a fascinating spot. You look at this scenario, and this one's weird. We just played a Blade Scout, and the opponent has 5 mana up they take an instant pass. That's a little concerning. That deck can do a lot of things at fast speed. Normally when someone has that much mana, they are going to be on, you know, some kind of a dedicated trick. And you really have to be thinking about the opponent's deck and what it could have, like the deck type, right? So we're going to be, you know, seeing, actually, let me just show you. I'll move my camera. You can see my camera during this play. I'm really thinking about this because this is actually like kind of crazy. There's a lot going on here. I end up taking a bit of a development. I do want to make sure I'm able to use my mana effectively, and I'm not too worried about, you know, that deck doesn't run stuff that's actually going to be killing my 3/1. They don't run a lot of like reactive spells in that way. So I will be fine with the Blade Scout just being a 3/1. We don't need to keep enough mana for Fury of the North, but I end up deciding long term that his passes are actually a little too threatening here. And there's a lot of things that could mean. A really common one is suit up. Especially a suit up that might have had a discount there. He'd have to play at that turn. That's a very common reason he'd be passing here. I have to basically take a really scared attack. And you should almost never do this. This is like an insanely specific situation. Don't do this. Like, mostly you should be full attacking, but it turns out, you know, he did have the potential jury rig threat, which is definitely a fairly big deal. It's something that we really didn't want to come down here, and he does use the suit up on the jury rig as well. This is the reason why we were a bit paranoid, and we can see it would have been pretty bad if I attacked with a 3/4. Now remember what I was saying last game. When the opponent uses a spell in an extremely loose way, that's usually a read they have a second one. His use of suit up there was pretty abysmal, right? I mean, he could have burned 1 mana, you know, it was like slightly efficient, but it just means he has a pretty clunky situation. Not necessarily a second suit up, but then he takes the open attack. Usually, especially with that deck, that's going to send a signal that you're going to be on a fast speed option. Although in this case, it doesn't end up mattering because whether he's on a fast speed option or not, I will have my counter. So it's not going to really affect our play here. And it is the second suit up. So we will have just like the direct and clean counter to that. Nothing really fancy going on here. You'll note we're not blocking the 4/4 with all our small units. And it's pretty important not to like go out of your way to block things like that. We're not really concerned with that. This is a deck that's going to be going wide and racing the opponent down. Trading an Omen Hawk for like 4 health on our side really isn't going to be doing anything because the Omen Hawk will represent at least 2 damage to them when we do a big swing in. You know, we've got Keeper of the Mask, so the Omen will do 2 damage, and then we can still block with it later, right? So really important. Don't be too timid on blocks. You should actually fairly rarely be blocking, especially when your health is already really high. We were at 18 health. We have no reason to keep that much health. Perfectly fine. So we draw the Wayfinder. We're going to go ahead and snap play it here. This is actually a bit of a misplay. We're supposed to be playing a bit more around red card here. And that can lead us to a few different plays. Probably Jeweled Protector is a little bit safer. We're not really in a hurry to be closing out this game, and the deck doesn't run any hard removal, so we have no problem making like a Windfare Hatchling really big. We're gonna go ahead and, you know, play the Kinku. We don't mind giving red card a bit of value. It's actually okay if it kills like 2 Omen Hawks or whatever, but just because we already had the Blade Scout and the first Omen Hawk on the board, it wasn't quite worth it giving that value. So we're going to go ahead and, take that swing in. Our Omen Hawks are going to have buff to the top deck, so we're going to have something pretty juicy coming in here on the next 2 draws. And yeah, we've just got blockers for days, right? Now we can see, now next time when he attacks with the Scrap Scuddler, now we can block it with a 1/1 if we want to. And, you know, we're basically dealing 1 damage to him at the cost of 4 to ourselves. But because this is a deck that's just kind of predicated on racing the opponent down, it ends up being fun. He ends up drawing the Twisted Fate off the top deck. You can see that off of the left side of his hand. That's where he played the Twisted Fate from. That means he just drew it. He didn't have it before, which we kind of knew because he would have had to have played it before. So we're totally fine with that. We can go ahead and slow down here. This is a perfectly fine Jeweled Protector. It's not going to be anything fancy, but the biggest thing is here, it makes his attacks really awkward. His quick attacks do get a bit shut down from this, and our Twin Disciplines can even like re-threaten if he's got, you know, something up his sleeve on the attack. So he really doesn't have an attack here. I mean, there shouldn't really be anything he can do. And then we're going to go into next turn. So now we have the 7-unit mana. We could play Hatchling, but unfortunately, without a wide enough board, Hatchling is going to have to wait. It's a pretty simple turn. We're going to go ahead and play Duo here. Of course, we can follow up with Keeper of the Masks. Now, a bit of a problem with Keeper of the Masks is we're looking at our spell mana, and we're thinking, okay, if I play Keeper, I actually don't have enough mana for the 2 remaining spells. I'm going to be 1 short. And that's fine because you normally don't want Will on offense. Almost always Will is a defensive card, so it's pretty okay tapping under Will here. It usually ends up kind of like not really mattering. So we are pretty safe here. This is like a pretty solid game. There's nothing like weird happening. We're thinking in terms of clock, right? You should always be thinking in the late game, abandon the idea of value. Value shouldn't even enter your mind in late game positions. Think in terms of clock, which is time to kill on both players' sides, and think in terms of probability of hand states, playing around certain hand states and playing to beat the maximum amount of opponent hand states possible, right? So clock means, you know, right now we are potentially threatening a clock of 1, killing him this turn. With Duo plus Twin Disciplines, reasonably speaking though, that's not going to happen. We're going to have to play more slow and more safe because, of course, you know, if he does have a very specific hand, he could threaten the Duo. That being said, he is on a deck that doesn't really have that reactive potential, and therein lies a really big fundamental flaw there. So we do potentially have the ability to go in a little bit more aggressively. Now, we do know that the deck also does run Sumpworks Map, which can be a little dangerous. They actually can do like an elusive block with that, and that's going to be something we really do have to be concerned about, right? Like, you know, maybe if we do an overly aggressive Twin Disciplines attack and then they sump block, then they might be able to kill our thing, and that's going to be pretty bad. But now that he's declared his attacker, there's not a single card in his deck that can actually really stop us when we go in here. And this just comes down to knowing the opponent's deck, right? Just immediately now that the declaration has been set, there's nothing that can stop this attack, right? And the blocking phase is over. And I think that this illustrates like this kind of mentality is super important. Know your opponent's deck. And I mentioned this before in my like tips to get to masters, but the number one thing when you're queuing ladder games, literally, before you even look at your mulligan hand, you should be looking at the opponent's deck and searching it up on Mobalytics. Literally tab out, go to Mobalytics, search up the region combination, and find the most common deck that matches it in terms of the champions, and then look at the list and be like, okay, he could have this, he could have this, he could have this. Literally before the game even starts, before you do your mulligan. Just know what the opponent's deck is likely to have. So here, like I said, the blocking was declared. So it's too late for Sumpworks Map because even though it goes back to him, he doesn't get a chance to reblock. And we're going to go ahead and close out this game. So a fairly clean game. Really, I don't think there's... I would say a really big thing that I'm trying to teach here, and you'll probably notice this just by watching these games, is fundamentals. It's not really about how to play this deck. This is a very vanilla deck. It is. But it does reward strong fundamentals. You do need to know the fundamentals of gameplay very well to play this deck. Playing around certain hand states, knowing like, you know, sometimes when to like commit. Clock is a really big deal. When you don't have the reach to kill them on one turn, just play full defensive and just make sure you are slowing them down so that you're buying yourself that additional turn. Because of course, you know, even if you cost yourself a ton of attack, by playing super defensive, you'll still almost always have like the same amount of clock if you're kind of just short of being able to reach within like a 1 turn time frame. You'll kind of always have the 2 no matter what. And then, you know what? For the third game, why don't we just queue ladder and I can just show you live. Those were 2 like decent examples. Hopefully you guys have been able to pick up some stuff from those. You'll also notice our rank right now we're at 334 LP. This is because this is actually a day later in recording. There was a whole mix up, and so it's been more than a day at this point. So yeah, I think we should be. Let me actually double check here. I think we are currently at this point in time still number one at 334. Yeah, okay. So we're still at number one at 334. So I mean, we'll risk that. Maybe we'll get knocked down just by queuing here. Who knows? But I figure, you know, I should show you guys like one of the live games, and not just do, you know, the recorded games. To be honest, that's not the real reason. The real reason is I wanted to do 3 games, but I realized I didn't actually have 3 recordings. I only had 2, so now I should have to do a live one. That's fine though, it's fine. No big deal. So yeah, now we're going to be using this, in this case, the fully updated version of the deck, not like the old, like early versions that were running like the super slow cards like Jeweled Protector and Lifeblade. Just terrible, terrible cards for this super fast meta. Okay, that was like 4 minutes. I can't believe I thought at first it was gonna be clean. So we're against Ruben Zoo here. For those of you guys who don't know, this is Steve Rubin. This is Riot's lead gameplay, like live balance designer. So he's the one that like is in charge of handling. He leads the team for like the balance patches basically. And we've actually queued into him 2 times also while playing this deck. We had a few funny games there. All right, so he's playing his own brand of elusives with like Braum, which is kind of like interesting. Ends up being like quite a bit slower. In this case, I tend to not really be valuing the Blade Scouts in these early positions. Let's just go ahead and try to get a little bit of extra value. We're keeping the Omen Hawk as we always do, mulliganing slightly deeper than normal. We are going to be in a mirror match really looking for Zed. Since we're attacking on odds, it's a really, really big deal to have the Zed, because if 2 Zed decks go against each other, the one that is attacking on odds is at a really huge advantage. Unfortunately, it looks like we haven't drawn our Zed, so we're unable to really capitalize on that advantage. Okay, so there's a couple things we can do here. We can play out our Conspirator. We're going to take some damage to these Blade Scouts. I think that'll end up being fine. Overall, it just comes down to like board control. The health values don't end up mattering like a super amount in the long term, so we can just go ahead and Conspirator the Hawk. Next turn, we're probably going to play Duo into Hawk, unless we top deck the Zed right here, which would be pretty nice. Unfortunate. So we actually have Double Hawk, which is sort of adorable. I mean, it does let us start getting the buffs a little bit earlier, and the Duo is actually not doing very much at all here. I might be inclined to go for the Double Hawk. There's actually a lot of things you could play that might send me into Elixir of Iron. So let's go ahead and play our first Hawk here. Our 1-1, because the 1-1 is better into this board, you know, whereas the 2-2 can get sort of screwed out. So he's got Zed. That's pretty interesting. And now we can think, if we want to, you know, potentially deal a little bit of extra damage, we can think to play Duo. That's fairly interesting. Okay, I'm pretty fine with this. I don't have any problems with any way that turned out. Now, the big question is, do we actually want to be like threatening that elusive value? I think I'd rather, in this case, bank mana for Elixir of Iron, as well as effectively just be trying to threaten out the, just trying to like threaten out his board, right? So our Omen Hawk has a bit of an attack into Blade Scout, but overall it just ends up a little bit behind. This attack is perfectly fine. The problem with Green Glade Duo in that position is that it doesn't really do its job very well as a blocker. And a really big thing is we want to get the buffs kind of as early as we can here. So now we've got an interesting decision point, right? You know, do we try to kill the Zed with the Elixir of Iron, or don't we? Now, you'll notice a really interesting thing here, which is we drew our own Zed, right? Now, he might have Will of Ionia or whatever, but if he doesn't, his Zed might actually end up not really mattering. The biggest reason for that is because if his Zed isn't able, you know, if we kill off the rest of his board, then his Zed won't do much against ours, because we have the bigger Zed and we'll be able to just kind of like power him down. So we're going to do a bit of a safe play here. Like I mentioned, we do have the ability to try to block it with Elixir, but it's really risky blocking a quick attack with Elixir. When they have mana, when they open attack, you expect him to have Fury, you expect him to have Twin Disciplines. In this case, letting the Zed level up doesn't make a damn difference, so it's perfectly fine. We've got a pretty sweet Wayfinder here. We don't need this Wayfinder to give any value other than this. We're still banking for the Elixir of Iron, and we have the Zed with the duo for next turn, which is going to be a really powerful play. You can tell here, like, part of the reason why I don't mind using Wayfinders on defense. Right now, we're not in a board state where the elusive keyword is really going to matter much in these positions, so it ends up being a lot better to do it like that, although it is counterintuitive. We'll finally play our duo. Usually it just gets blocked by the assassin, but we might be able to keep it alive with the Elixir of Iron. And then the big kahuna himself, Zed, the big threat. So if he has will, he should snap it off here. There is the will, okay? So that's a bit of a threat. Now it could come down to a race. He does have the ability to race us down pretty effectively. Let's go ahead and evaluate our attacks, right? So we've got some fairly free attacks here. His Zed does have the ability to block our 2-1s pretty well, which is not good because losing out on potential chump blockers in this situation isn't great, especially when we look 2 turns from now. On 7, we're going to be playing our hatchling for the attack. We are going to want a full board at that point in time, so we do have to leave these 2-1s back. He will always block the Zed into a 2-1 because he knows that, you know, there's going to be nothing happening there, right? He knows that we can't deal 1 damage, so there's no punish. So at this point, we can just take our free Elixir. It's great to have the Elixir in a spot where it's like unpunishable. We know he's tapped out, and we know he can't really punish our duo just kind of remaining at 1 health. So it's just a really like comforting play there. And now the big thing is we are going to want to probably lean into the elusive game plan, right? So what we can do is we can take this block. We can try to play for the like Windfarer Hatchling after this, but as we can see, the Zed level up doesn't really bother me. We are just going to be blocking everything down anyway. So at this point in time, we do have the ability to play Zed, and we could think about it, but we really need our board to be as wide as it can be. We're just going to go ahead and bounce the Kinku and replay this for the full board size on our Windfarer Hatchling. Now we are going to tap out, and that is a little bit dangerous, but with a full board of really big elusives, usually it ends up being totally fine. Okay. Like I said, it's pretty unfortunate that we didn't have Zed on turn 3. We did draw it later, but we drew it like on the turns where will can kind of shut it down anyway, right? Whereas like you can't really will the Zed on turn 3. So if we had had the Zed on turn 3, we definitely would have established a lot more like dominance in the early game, and that tempo would have been in our favor. But we have no problem just kind of like letting the Zed through. So he's going to go ahead and play his Kinko Lifeblade. I'm perfectly fine with that. Won't really affect this too much, and we're just going to go ahead and make the board big and make the board wide, right? Again, the elusive tag isn't really going to be relevant here. So we play our big Windfarer Hatchling at this point. We're threatening a pretty big attack. Of course, we're tapped out, and he's got 9, right? So he's probably on a double trick. That's going to be Will plus Fury, Will plus Twin, Twin plus Fury. Maybe throw in possibly a third if he's got, like, you know, an Elixir of Iron or something like that. There are different things that could be. Okay, so when you're dealing with lifesteal, you do want to make sure that you're exploiting it. In this case, what that means is making his lifesteal a bit more potentially awkward by making the things it wants to block go on the right side. So what that's going to mean is we're going to attack like this. So the thing his Lifeblade most wants to block is the 4-2. It's a good trade. And then the next up is the 6 attack one, then this, and then so on and so forth. So basically, if his health was high, if his health was like 19 or 20, we would do the opposite because we actually want his Lifeblade to be blocking the left side so he overheals. But here, it's pretty much not going to affect anything. Sometimes it can make their play a bit more awkward. It's just technically proper to send the Lifeblades like closer to the right side than anything else. So he's got to have Twin Disciplines, I think, for the Zed block here to make a ton of sense. If he submits this through, we should just have a pretty free win. I don't know if he'd be able to really do much to contest us at that point. So he's just deciding what his option wants to be, whether it's going to be a Fury to save Zed or probably to lifesteal and keep the Kinko alive. I think he should go for the lifesteal and the elusive. This is very interesting. I mean, he's got to buff the elusive up. Okay, so yeah, he'll keep the Zed alive with elixir and then go for a will there. Now that is really interesting. So he's going down to 4 himself. He's keeping his Zed up as a threat. He's keeping one of his life blades alive, but he's not able to really threaten too much with it. And okay, that's pretty interesting. So we do have blockers for the Zed. You know, he's got his own hatchling, so he's threatening the second elusive. Of course, we have our own second elusive. So it ends up being fine here. He's tapped out this time, which gives us kind of like that bit of an advantage there. It's always kind of nice to be the one in that position, right? So if we want to, we can use our Will of Ionia on the Lifeblade. Getting it in under deny is going to be, I think, a pretty important advantage. So yeah, I'm perfectly happy doing it like this. Really just like making sure we are killing him is probably going to be the single biggest thing here. We just want to make sure that we are ending this game and not letting him lifesteal us up. The biggest thing is, like, you know, he has 1 mana, which means he doesn't really have a lot of reactive options here. So we can go ahead and trade for the hatchling. That's pretty free. If we want to, we can let one of these Zed shots hit us. You know, 4 health is definitely a safety range. There's really no reason to not tank it. Because we just want to extend our range. And this is like a really, really important mentality to develop. We really can't be blocking with our Kinku here. Even though it might be a little scary going down to 4 health, at the end of the day, it's going to have less of a chance of making a difference than keeping our Kinku up as a potential threat. So now we have a few things. I mean, we have a pretty good open attack here. You know, we also have potentially twin disciplines off of this attack. Whereas if we develop, we might face the wrath of his Lifeblade, which could be buffed on a fast speed trick. So if we threaten the attack in here like this, plus our trick, he would need to be on something like a double will hand to win. And I think that would be really hard for him. He's used 2 wills already. I think we should win if we do this. I don't see how this doesn't turn into a win. It could end up being a little bit risky. We'll see. To be honest, I'm not sure what options he could be on there, but we will go ahead and, you know, clean out the win. So he was D1, so we are able to successfully gatekeep the Riot lead balance guy from being Masters this season. Man, I queue into him a lot. He's actually always playing at like late hours like I am. But yeah, Ruben, he's actually a very good player. And yeah, that's basically it. That's the deck in a nutshell. It's insane. It just keeps winning. It doesn't lose. Right now, as of the time I say this, currently both me and the number 2 player on the NA ladder, who apparently just net decked me, are using this deck, and plenty of other players in the master ladder. It's a super strong deck. It's going to win you a lot of games as long as you're kind of clean on your fundamentals, your trades. That game, we really explained how you gotta be pretty fast and loose against the Zed, right? We let the Zed level up, and we let him deal extra damage to us, and we do that so that we can have a more developed board, so that we can race him down better, right? And, you know, obviously you don't always want to do that, but don't be too terrified of Zed in those kinds of situations. All right, and that's it. That's the deck guide. You know, like I said, it's going to be on my site. You should make sure you are checking the site, by the way, because I've actually been experimenting with some different ways of running elusives, and there's a very good chance that in less than a week, I might make some major changes to this deck, making it even more cancerous. I have some ideas that I need to sort of like test out. I'm messing around with a lot of weird things on my stream, like using different styles of elusives deck. And I do think that this version is not optimized yet. So I'm going to make it better in the coming week. Make sure you are checking the site so that you can get the most up-to-date version. When I say check the site, I have no vested interest in the site. I'm not pulling ads. I literally made that for you guys. Nobody discovers me through the site. It's not like, you can't like Google something and like find me through the site. It's just a resource that I made to help you guys out. So yeah, check out the site for, you know, the updated Kinku list. and enjoy your free, easy ladder climb. All right, guys, that's it for me. I'll see you guys next time.